Okay, I think we're gonna get started. We'll just have a really intimate conversation here because I do want to hear a lot of your views, Melissa, as well as Anita. And then what we're going to do is we're recording this, so we're going to be sharing this with all our young founders, especially the ones who are going to be working on mental health issues. So let's keep this really casual. It won't be a formal webinar, and just let's chat about wellness, okay, mental health. So first and foremost, I want to thank Anita as well as Melissa for spending your valuable Saturday afternoon with me. So to introduce to everyone, Anita is the Chief Wellbeing Officer at MindFi, which is a Y Combinator startup in cohort 21. MindFi is a B2B mental health and well-being solution. Anita is also a US trained psychologist, counselor, and dance instructor with extensive experience working in hospitals, social enterprises, and corporate programs. And then we have Melissa, who is the co-founder and CEO at Bravely, a mental health startup that helps you discover the habits that impact your mental health and teaches you what you need to learn to do it better. Melissa is a leukemia survivor and a serial entrepreneur that has been featured in various media. As someone who struggled with mental health for most of her life, Bravely was born out of her determination to create something that will truly make a difference to people who need it. So again, thank you so much, Anita and Melissa. I can't, even start to express how grateful I am to actually have both of you here with me today. Okay, maybe to kick off, I wanted to really actually hear your story, right? This is such a deep and important topic. I would really actually like to hear maybe from Anita, right? Your story, your journey. What got you interested in the topic of mental wellness or mental health, and what is it that you're building today at MindFi?
Thanks for the introduction, Eiling. And I'll share a little bit about my mental health story. So I've always been interested in people. I think I'm somebody who's always been very in touch with my feelings, very much a people person. And when I went to university, I chose to study psychology because I wanted to work with people and support them. But after graduating with my master's degree and spending some time working in a hospital setting in a social enterprise, I realized that a lot of the cases I saw were really, really severe cases that could be prevented if people had earlier support, if people had maybe more education and knowledge on mental health, if they had the tools and resources, then they would not be coming to see me in such a severe state. I worked at a hospital, so we had failed suicide attempts. We had people who were facing legal problems because of the inability to cope with their mental health issues. So that's when I decided to switch gears and go into preventive mental health to try and spread public awareness, to try and get people to build their resource kits so that they can tackle their mental health issues very, very early on so that it doesn't escalate and all of us can actually live in a state of mental well-being rather than feel like we are struggling to support our mental health. So that's a little bit about my interest and focus in the mental health space.
Thank you, Anita. And Melissa, can you share a little bit more? I know your story is very personal, so please feel free to share as much as you're comfortable sharing.
Oh, thank you. So mine definitely isn't coming from an academic background. My interest in mental health has always been something that's really a personal struggle of mine, and it's something that I've dealt with for more than 2/3 of my life. So even from when I was a kid, it was something that I found I had a really hard time with. And there was just nowhere to go. There was no one to talk to. I think back then I didn't even know that I could talk to somebody, or it was something that was to be talked about. And I think that's one of the biggest things with stigma, is that it keeps people quiet when they should be able to say something, speak up, or to have somebody ask something about them. So my experience was that I thought for the longest time that it was just me, and I continued through the years thinking that it was just me. And I know later on we're going to talk a bit about social media, but when I was a teenager, that's when social media really started happening. And of course, for a teenager struggling with mental health, that's one of the worst things that you can possibly have just suddenly take over your lives. So my journey with it was always really personal, as I started a business, and I found that on the surface I was sort of living this life that seemed really awesome. You know, I was running a business, I was traveling a lot, I was doing a lot of fun things, but on the inside I was still having a really hard time, and no amount of distractions really ever did the job. It would distract me for a bit, and then the second a distraction stopped, it was kind of back to where I was before. So eventually was just after 10 years of running a business, which was designing apps for lots of other industries. And I saw all sorts of apps being designed, from cryptocurrency to other kinds of fintech, F&B, every type of app under the sun. And there wasn't a single one that had anything to do with mental health. And at some point, after 10 years of doing that, I realized that it just seemed a bit ridiculous that there weren't any mental health apps. And back then it was like, yeah, Headspace is a mental health app, which Headspace is great, but it's not quite a mental health app. And so decided to embark on something that I felt personally really, really passionate about. And what Eling was prefacing was that at the end of 2019, I was actually diagnosed with leukemia, and I spent all of that time and 2020 going through all the treatment, all the chemo, and obviously going through cancer takes a big toll on your mental health. So you kind of pile on more on top of that. And again, it was one of those things where, you know, a lot of things took priority, from obviously physical health, medication, the finances of having to go through all of that, how everybody else was dealing with it. But there were very little resources for me and my husband, and we were both struggling, obviously, with the diagnosis and the treatment. And then being stuck in the hospital during a pandemic where nobody can really come see you, you're left even more isolated. And so that's where I think tech, for all the amazing things that it does, needs to extend that amazingness into mental health, wellness, and connecting people as well.
You know, I think what you said about you didn't know that it was even something to talk about, you didn't know where to go. Today, even with all the awareness that's out there and all the solutions, it sometimes still feels that way. So I'm really glad and, you know, appreciative that both of you are building something so impactful. And tell us a little bit about Bravely. So what is Bravely in a 1-2-liner?
Oh yeah, that's a good thing to not miss out. So with Bravely, what we're really trying to do is to use technology and design to make it so that you're able to discover the habits that you have every day that can actually impact your mental health, whether negatively or positively. And what we really want to do is to use that to try and find and surface the most relevant content and knowledge that you would find in books, textbooks, therapists, neuroscientists, put that all together in a way that you can access on your phone in really just bite-sized pieces, and just written in a way that is really engaging, so that, you know, it doesn't feel like homework, or it doesn't feel like you have to sit down in a classroom, because I'm sure everybody would agree that the best way to learn is when you're actually interested. And so we're really trying to create a mental health app that you feel like you want to use, not have to use because you're having a hard time with your mental health.
Thank you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the spectrums, right? Because I think a lack of understanding or a mischaracterization of a mental health problem can actually discourage people from getting the needed treatment. And sometimes we've also been kind of blurring the lines between health versus disease, right, or illness. And this can again cause people to misjudge, dismiss, or even stigmatize those who do have mental illness. Can you help us clarify the spectrum of mental health? So what do we mean when we refer to mental wellness versus mental illness? Are we blurring the lines here? What do people need to know? Maybe we can start with you, Anita.
Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna use this as like baseline. And when I talk about mental health, I refer to things that are below baseline: depression, anxiety, difficult emotions, difficult feelings, things that we struggle with. So back when I was working as a therapist in a hospital, what I was working to do was try and remove these symptoms of depression, remove these symptoms of anxiety, help people manage their stress so they can get from down here back to baseline. So this is what I'm referring to when I talk about mental health. Now, when I talk about well-being and mental wellness, it's about increasing maybe your satisfaction at work, improving your relationships with the people who are important to you, experiencing joy and happiness more often and more intensely in your life. So it's about going from baseline and bringing it up, being, thriving, flourishing, being as joyful and fulfilled as you can be.
That is really, really insightful. I mean, like I said, I don't have a lot of knowledge in this space, so thank you for actually explaining that. Melissa, do you refer to the same way, or do you have a different definition?
I think for me, I find it really helpful to compare it to how we treat physical health, which is that in terms of physical health, you also have sort of a spectrum. You can lead a healthy or unhealthy lifestyle, and I think we all kind of know what those tend to look like. But of course, if you get really, really sick, then that becomes an illness. So it's a similar thing as well with mental health. And I think one of the common misconceptions is that if you're struggling with your mental health or mental wellness, this means that you're actually sick in some way, when the truth is everybody has mental health. And if you take care of it every day, it's one of those things that obviously can help. But it doesn't mean that if you're having a hard time with your mental health, that you are considered somebody who has mental illness. There is a distinction between the two, but everyone has mental health.
Mm.
Okay. No, that's fascinating. And we're just really scratching the surface here. But I want to talk about another distinction, right? So relationship between mental health and generations, or rather, maybe not so much generations, but rather people at different life cycles. So can we talk a little bit about, is there a difference? What are the triggers and what are the unique challenges that each group faces? So, kids facing, when we talk about kids in terms of mental health, when we talk about students, so older students, working adults, new mothers, the silver generation, what are you seeing in terms of triggers and unique challenges that they all face? And it could also be common challenges that they all face. And we'll start with you, Melissa.
Sure. Okay. So I sort of smiled because I just, as you were sort of listing out the groups of people, you could see all the different challenges that they would face. And I think something that, if you look at the statistics, something alarming that is happening is that the younger generation are increasingly struggling with their mental health, much more than before. And the hypothesis, at least my hypothesis, is that I believe a huge part of it is due to social media and digital media, and the sort of lives that you end up living around that. So I think, across the different groups, there are lots of different things that people are struggling with, but I feel like a common thread to all of that is a sense of isolation and stigma, and a sense of comparison. So something that weighs on your self-esteem. I think that the younger generation tend to be a lot more exposed to that, just because, if you sort of look at teenagers, they spend a lot of time comparing with each other. And then now you have social media that puts that on steroids, basically, because now you can compare yourself not just within a close group of people that you have or people in your school, you're comparing with the most influential people in the world. And that becomes, you're the standard that you think you're supposed to hit, which is completely unrealistic. And then when you throw in, like photoshopping type apps, it just takes it to a whole new level. But if you look at sort of kids who are even younger than that, they're starting to live in a world where not only is social media, digital media completely the norm, and they start being exposed to that at a younger and younger age, those impossible ideals, where before, maybe within our generation when we were kids, the impossible ideals you saw on TV, you saw on Hollywood, on covers of magazines, and now the impossible ideals, supposedly everyday people that's just around us. And what's really difficult is that there's nowhere in school that gives you the lessons that you should learn. There's nowhere where they're having conversations about what mental health should be, about stigma, about all the dangers of social media. And when you put somebody who doesn't have that knowledge, is not equipped to take on something like this, where even adults are struggling in their relationships with social media, much less, younger kids who don't know what it should be like. It can just make things really difficult, and then it sort of snowballs from there. So I think a huge part of what's missing is really just a place in society where we can do something about general mental health literacy. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think I went off on a bit of a tangent.
No, I think you basically, and I'm going to skip the other question later, which is your take on social media and excessive tech, because I think your stance is clear on that, right? But that was helpful. So I think you've pinpointed one that's really relevant, right? It is a true relevant trigger, and one that's so dominant these days. But Anita, what is your take, right? What are the triggers across different generations?
I fully agree with what Melissa was saying about, kids these days growing up with the influence of social media, and this is a really difficult thing to manage in your teenage years. And I also want to add that, earlier Melissa said that, social media came about when she was a teenager. And then I realized that I'm like slightly older. And so social media only showed up when I was in university. And the impact it had on my life would be a little bit different because I was in a different stage. I was a little bit older, a little better equipped to manage how I felt about social media. So, you have people at different life stages experiencing different issues, but different generations, even if it's just maybe 5-10 years apart, they're going to have different struggles as well, because their interaction with technology, their influence that they get from technology is going to be different. So it's really interesting because perhaps in the past you can expect a certain set of problems and issues at each life stage, but then now teenagers now have different struggles compared to teenagers 5-10 years ago. So that's something really interesting that's happening. I personally work a lot with working adults. So MindFi works with corporate employees. And so the huge thing that I see a lot of these days is people struggling with work-life balance, even before the pandemic, but even more so with the pandemic. So themes that I see a lot are burnout, people feeling burnt out, especially now that there's a blurring of boundaries between work and personal life. Another thing that I see people struggle with a lot is psychological safety. A lot of people don't feel that sense of psychological safety in the workplace. They don't feel comfortable opening up and sharing about issues that they're facing. So even if it's not related to mental health, there's some companies or some employees who don't feel safe expressing maybe differences in opinion, differences in ideas, and that creates a barrier to expressing maybe vulnerability or talking about their own mental health. So I think psychological safety is a big theme that's really important that we get right, because it's hard to progress or make any advancements in having conversations about mental health if there is no sense of psychological safety.
That is amazing. And I want to come back to that because I'm then curious to know how your solution, does it actually facilitate, open up and enable, the creation of that psychological safety. But let's go back and start a little bit with no tech. I'm curious, let's move into solutions basically, right? Tech enabled and non-tech enabled solutions. So far we've talked about what are the triggers, right? And they are, social media, work-life balance. In fact, the other topic also is actually new moms, right? New moms today generally also face a lot of comparison, and that is also partially brought about by social media as well, seeing how other moms seem to be having it all and doing it so perfectly. So definitely one thing there. But if we talk a little bit about solutions now, right? Let's start a little bit with no tech. And now I'm going to go to you first because I'm pretty sure you have a strong no tech solution to maintaining your mental well-being and mental health. So what is it that you do on a daily, weekly basis to take care of your own mental health?
Yep. So maybe one of the reasons why I bring up sort of digital a lot, which always strikes me as quite ironic because that's basically where I work at. It's tech, and for 10 years I spent 10 years trying to design apps that people can't put down. And obviously now I'm trying to utilize that in a good way and not just to sell you burgers. But part of the reason why I bring it up is because it's something that I also personally struggle with. If your phone is a safe place to retreat to, especially if you're having a hard time, and that's always that safe spot that you have just in your hand, no matter where you are, you're going to start having this dependent relationship with your phone and whatever it is that is on your phone. And soon, whatever your phone is showing you, you're just going to be trained by that basically to respond. So one of the huge things in talking about no tech, I know it's still within tech, is to find better ways to actually limit how much it can sort of hook you in and pull you back in. This is things like having no notifications switched on for specific apps. It could even be having extensions in your browser that would block feeds that don't serve you very well. But outside of, if I put away the phone, which I always try and do, I think a huge thing is sleep. And sometimes internally I roll my eyes when I say that, just because I feel like my parents telling me again how important sleep is. And it was always one of those things where, especially when I was younger, it was just like, I don't need to sleep. 8 hours is for old people. Like, I can get by. Like, look at how tough I am. And of course, that's not practical. It's not realistic. Nobody can get by on not enough sleep. And sleep is just at such a foundation of not just how your mental health is, but just how your day goes, as simply as that, like how you feel throughout your day. And if you even sort of distill it down into just that one unit of one day, not even talking about mental wellness and health across sort of the big picture, if you look at how a lack of sleep impacts that following day, all the things that you aren't able to do that you want to do, how your mood is, how you talk to yourself, how you interact with other people, and you can see how much that day is affected. And now if you compound that over time, over the years, that really starts to just snowball and yeah, like I said, it compounds. So I think getting enough sleep is probably one of the simplest, biggest things to do. And I would say as well that it is getting increasingly difficult, and over time people are having more and more of a problem with that, and it does come back down to tech. It comes back down to not being able to put down the phone or stop watching something. Your exposure to blue light as well cannot be understated. So I'm sorry if I still kept mentioning tech, but there is a relationship there because it is so just relevant in our lives. But the answer that's no tech is definitely sleep.
Got it. Thank you. Anita, so, if we're moving the tech solutions itself, the wellness space, especially the mental wellness tech space, I think definitely has heated up. VCs, we see a lot of the solutions, and I'm sure you've kind of mapped out your whole competitor landscape as well, right? So what's interesting though, I think, is like the different use cases of technology. So we're seeing it used across, education, prevention, diagnosis, treatment. Oftentimes, maybe more a little bit on the education prevention side, less on diagnosis. I think we see some attempting to solve for treatment as well by providing access to therapists and psychologists. What are your thoughts on the current mental wellness solutions landscape? If you could just share, off the top of your head, any app globally that you look at that's interesting.
So you mentioned, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of work done in like prevention, education, awareness, but let's talk a little bit more about diagnosis and treatment, because I think that that space is heating up a little bit. And MindFi is also starting to enter the space, as are a lot of players across Southeast Asia. So typically we stay away from diagnosis, but talk therapy via mental health apps is actually picking up in this part of the world. In the US, it's already been very popular for quite a while, but in this part of the world,
can I ask you to elaborate a little bit more about what talk therapy is?
Yeah, talk therapy, TALK. So counseling, basically. So doing teletherapy, which means video therapy with a licensed psychologist or counselor. So this is picking up, and I think it's really exciting and valuable that this is happening, because Asia actually has a big shortage of mental health professionals. So if you look at the numbers that we have in Asia, we have far, far less than the US and Europe. So the US has about 30 psychologists per 100,000 members of the population. Some of the Scandinavian countries have more than 100 psychologists per 100,000 members of the population. But in most Asian countries, the number is 1 or below 1. So there's a big, big shortage. So if we can match people up via therapy, it's a more efficient use of the therapist's time. This booking is more efficient. People don't have to be physically close to the therapist. They get easy access, even if there isn't a therapist near where you live, you know, especially if you're in Philippines or Indonesia and you're not in a city. So it helps to connect people to therapists more easily. And then something that we and some other platforms are trying to do is to provide group therapy on these tech platforms as well, so that you connect one therapist to a circle of people so that more people get access to care and support. So this works pretty well in Asia because one, you don't feel alone, you know, there's a bit of a community element to it. So it kind of helps to break down the stigma. You're not the only one with this problem. Other people have it as well. And then the other reason why people like it is also, you know, people are still unsure of therapy. Some people, at least, are still maybe not very comfortable going into therapy. So if you're in a group, there's a little less attention, a little less limelight on you. You share the space with maybe 10 other people rather than having a full hour that's centered on you. So it gives people this like taster of therapy, and perhaps for some people that's adequate support. But yeah, tech platforms are actually starting to go into this talk therapy space, which I think can bring a lot of value to Asia.
That's actually really interesting, because honestly, if I were to just think of it from the surface, right, I would have assumed that Asia, the population here, would refrain from group therapy because they want that, you know, personal one-on-one. They don't want to open up to people that they don't really know. They don't feel, you know, how do they know that this is a circle of trust, right? And it's a group of people that everything that's shared here stays here. How did you land upon that, and what kind of validation or market study did you do before realizing that group therapy could work?
So we have been actually experimenting with this on the MindFi app. We've been running a number of these sessions, and we've been doing a lot of testing, changing group sizes, you know, giving people the option to have the camera off, you know. So we're finding that our kind of anonymous circles are picking up a little bit, where people get access to ask their therapist anything that they want, but they don't have to reveal their identity. And we make sure the sessions are not recorded. So these are some of the strategies that have shown to be a little bit more popular on our app, but we're still playing around and experimenting with this. I'm hoping to eventually have some more long-term circles, so people can meet up once a week with the same group of people and grow together. And these circles can be centered around various themes. So it could be, you know, a grief circle for somebody who's lost somebody who's important. We could have burnout circles. Something we also have are like LGBTQ circles. So circles to bring together people who are facing the same issues and create a little community around that is led by a therapist to give some guidance and support.
I definitely am looking forward to seeing more of these. I'll definitely check out the MindFi app. And, you know, you touch upon grief circle as well. I think that's one that I I really wish existed even today. I lost my dad when I was 17, and and there was no support, right? Even until today, it's really hard to find that place, and it's something that's so, not to say frowned upon, but people just don't know how to react, don't know how to deal with it. And those, especially when it happens to you in childhood, that's the weight that you carry, and that's something that I do know, has an impact on mental health, mental well-being of a lot of people. So thanks so much for the work that you do, Anita. As you were saying, you were experimenting a lot, to try and also understand what people are comfortable with. We haven't even spoken about cost yet, but my guess is that you're really trying to drive adoption right now rather than optimizing for cost and all that, right? Is that right?
Well, MindFi is a B2B platform, so we sell to the employer, so that reduces one of the barriers for adoption, because the users don't have to think about paying out of their own pocket. So we sell to companies for their employees.
Got it. That's a smart move. Moving forward, along with Melissa, actually, Anita shared a little bit about the move and the shift and the rise in talk therapy and all that. In your realm and what you've been seeing, right? What are your thoughts on the current mental wellness solution landscape? Anything that you want to add? And also another controversial question I do want to pose to you is that, do you think the solutions are being adopted as highly and as quickly as you think it should be?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, the answer to that is quite simply no. I don't think it is as adopted as quickly as it should be. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons is stigma. I mean, stigma for a lot of people means that if they admit they're having a hard time with their mental health, it's because they're weak, and nobody wants to admit that about themselves. So I think that is a big part of the reason why it's still not as widespread. I think in quite a few circles, there is a lot more talk and discussions about mental health, which is really helping with that. And something else that really helps as well with tech solutions is that you oftentimes, you can just be by yourself and have nobody know that you have downloaded it, you're using it, you're trying something out. So it does lower the barrier that stigma has put up. But there is still a lot of that stigma that lives outside of how people look at you. It's also how you look at yourself a lot, what you've been told. So I think the adoption it needs to be higher, and I believe that it will be as well with how things are going. A huge part to play with what I believe is that the apps that are currently being designed, it started out with there being a lot of sort of online replicas of offline solutions. So for example, talk therapy, it's something that happened offline and then now we're putting it online. But when it comes to tech, there are certain limitations with that, or there's certain things where you're comfortable doing and not comfortable doing. And sometimes talk therapy online therapy is great. Like I personally have been doing it for many, many years. But sometimes you do miss having that sort of personal connection as well. And I think with everybody going into remote working, we're seeing that we might all still be working with computers, but it's still not the same experience. And I think there is some aspect of that. With Bravely, what we're really trying to do is to leverage tech in a way that's very intuitive, but also very delightful, and just kind of change the experience of working on your mental health. It shouldn't be something that you only do because you really have to, an experience that you don't want to do, but you must, and you kind of don't have a choice, and just change that, because it shouldn't have to be like that. And I think especially at an early stage as well. So mental health literacy, just at a very sort of general level, is something that we really want to help change. It is that, when they say knowledge is power, they're really not wrong. And when it comes to knowledge that we have in mental health, it is still quite low for the general population. And I think that's really the thing that needs to change.
So stigma, I think that's the big word, right? And you touched a little bit upon how personally, as a person, how do I remove that stigma and understand that this is, it's fine working on my self-health, right? My personal wellness itself. What about peers, your support system? So, parents, family, friends, teachers, right? Workplace as well. How do we educate them on mental wellness, mental health? How do we also help defeat the stigma with this, I guess, peripheral support system, or just system or network to start with?
Yeah, that's a really, really tricky one, because if we're sort of talking as an individual who's struggling with their mental health, being surrounded by a support system that maybe isn't very supportive, or maybe isn't as educated when it comes to mental health, it can be really challenging for the person who's having a hard time to also take on the added job of trying to educate people or trying to change their minds when they're already struggling on their own. So for that, I find that there isn't maybe as much that's easy to do. The general, maybe slightly cliched advice is you find your tribe, like you find the people who will support you, the people who will be open to that. And you would still have, all the people that who have always been your friends, family, support group. Even if they are not understanding, you can find a certain level where you're both kind of happy to live with. So if you're a person having a hard time and the people around you aren't understanding, maybe the first step isn't to get them to understand, but the first step is to establish a boundary that they can respect. So, just lay out certain simple rules for things that, maybe they should do, shouldn't do, and then just accept that that is what you need for now. And over time, hope that they can sort of get there with the education. And I think in terms of general, what society as a whole can do is to keep having these sort of conversations, no matter, how big or how small. It's just to be having them constantly, frequently, making them accessible to people so that people can see talking about mental health, talking about mental wellness should be an everyday conversation, because it is something that you live with every day. It shouldn't be one of those things that is a big deal. And I'm hoping that as the years go by, we'll be having conversations about mental health and wellness that's so common. It's not a big deal anymore. You can't really turn it into an event like you can right now, because it's just like, well, why are we having an event about this when we talk about it every day? Like, that's the hope for where I would like to see society go. I know that we still have quite a long way to go, but this is the starting point, having these discussions made available on multiple platforms at any time. That's really where it should be.
Thanks, Anita. And you mentioned the word accessibility, and I wanted to actually now go to Anita, because Anita, in a different manner, right? Anita, earlier you mentioned accessibility in terms of talk therapists, right? So that there's still a shortage in that. And I guess that is a challenge in itself. So from your point of view, right, what kind of solutions are actually needed to solve some of these challenges? So, there are solutions that solve challenges relating to stigma, to normalizing. Is there also a need, a space to come up with something that actually makes access to therapists even more accessible, maybe even just increasing the pool of the number of therapists to start with?
So what I've been seeing trending a lot, MindFi doesn't do this, but I've been seeing a lot of this in the space, is chatbots, usually based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is what I've been seeing a lot of. I've used some of them. I don't really find that they maybe capture the essence of really speaking to a therapist and the connection in the same way. But I think it's a start, it's the start of something that will evolve. The other thing is, maybe someplace we can start from is just education, giving people resources. This could be videos and articles to help them understand their own mental health better, understand a little bit more about the struggles they face, why they have it, that everybody else faces it too, what they can do about it, giving them very actionable and practical tools and tips and techniques that they can use, so to try and give people resources for self-care. I think that's the best way we can make things accessible, because it's free. It's something that can be distributed free. It's something that can be accessed remotely wherever you are. So I think, the next step up is speaking to a therapist, but even via video therapy, there's an element of cost to it. There's that limitation of the therapist, but self-care resources available on the app is something that can be distributed, no cost, for an app that can be downloaded free and can be accessed anywhere you have internet. So I think that's something that MindFi, I'm sure Bravely, and a lot of other mental health tech companies are trying to do.
To anyone who is listening, if you have any questions at all for either Anita or Melissa, please put it in the chat and we will actually address them. Okay, so Anita and Melissa, I've heard a lot about really self-care. It starts from actually the start right now. The key focus is really self, right, from yourself itself. But Anita, earlier on, you also mentioned that you were working with corporates, and one key thing with the working adults is this whole work-life balance and the lack of psychological safety, right? Is there anything that you're doing or you think can be done in terms of just the wider ecosystem again? I know I keep trying to bring it a bit wider, that circle, but is there anything else that's being done in terms of helping managers, leadership, organizations, even just set up a framework to create a safe work environment?
So that's exactly what we try and do. So whenever we launch with a company, we always get the CEO or a member of the leadership team to come in and maybe talk for 5-10 minutes and share a little bit about their own mental health journey, about a bit about their own well-being practices. So if the leadership is willing to have these honest, vulnerable conversations, that sets the tone for everybody else. And the other thing that we try and do is we sometimes organize trainings for managers and on how managers can build psychological safety within a team. Sometimes we run trainings on mental health first aid, so that you plant these well-being champions all across the company. So it's not just the CEO, but we have well-being champions in every department, in every team. And this way you can start to build a culture of well-being within the company. Something else that we also like to do is we have fireside chats with some of these well-being champions, and we just openly talk about mental health, what their well-being and self-care practices are, and just to create these conversations and normalize them. So I think, if you hear your manager or somebody else in your company sharing about their personal experience, you're going to feel like it's safe to talk to him or her about your own experiences as well.
So how's that working out? Do you see more and more senior leaders actually opening up and being vulnerable?
Yeah, so actually, we've never had anybody say no. They've all been very open about sharing a little bit about their well-being practices, and some of them have even very openly said that they speak to a counselor, they speak to a therapist. Some of them have shared that, they struggle with insomnia due to the stress that they face, and they actually have to take sleeping pills. So sometimes it's been I've been quite amazed by the level of vulnerability that I do see.
That's amazing. I think that's so needed. We have a question in the chat. How do you think we can best get schools to educate students on mental health? Melissa, any thoughts here? Any suggestions?
I was a bit worried you were going to ask me, because I was, frankly speaking, a terrible student. And I'm sure that my previous schools would just be horrified that I'm attempting to answer this question. But maybe as a terrible student, I could tell you some of the things that I personally thought would have worked. I think with putting anything into school, sort of the simpler that you make it and the more that you repeat it, the more likely it is to speak. One of the best things to do is to make it so that this topic is not daunting, it is not dry, it doesn't feel like somebody that's nagging at you. Instead, it feels like something that is great to learn about. If you can actually make it so that it's fun. I mean, we try and make other types of learning fun, whether it's, I don't know, math or geography, it should be the same thing for trying to start that education out right, is to get the interest. I think the interest is really critical here, more than just trying to cram them full of information and then giving them an exam to test how much of that they've actually remembered. Is how can you create something that would get them just being able to be interested, to want to pay attention, but then also be able to start cultivating some of these habits from the start, something that's, again, very approachable. I think that's really the best way to go. I would say something else that schools can do as well. Most schools, I believe, have some sort of a counselor that's made available, but the route to get to or to talk to a counselor is not very clear. It's often quite convoluted. It takes many steps, and this many steps means that not only do you have to first be like, okay, well, I'm willing to talk to a counselor. Now I have to talk to one teacher and then the department head and then somebody else, and then they'll let me talk to a counselor. But also I feel like the counselors there tend to do, multiple jobs, and very often that job has to do with, very troublesome kids or anyone who's breaking the rules a lot. And so you definitely feel the weight of that if you want to go and talk to somebody. So I think the avenues of how somebody would, that experience of going and talking to somebody within the school context needs to be as easy, as private, and just as sort of stigma-free as you possibly can make it.
Yeah, and I think it's as simple as even not having a statement saying, "Oh, I heard you went to the counselor's office today," right? Because that already makes it sound like it's something that's vague and unusual.
Yeah.
I love that advice, because I think this is very relevant, right, for the young founders itself, because they're still in school, and that means that they are actually in the position to try and make that change, speak to their teachers, speak to the school principal, and all that things. So, Anita, what about you? Anything to add on?
It feels like a long time since I've been in school, but I think having the education be more experiential, I think, is something that's really valuable. I think teaching students how to build their self-awareness is something that could be the start of being able to understand your own mental health, being able to recognize and identify your feelings, being able to put a name to your feelings. I think a lot of people actually struggle to identify what it is they're feeling. Being able to identify physiological symptoms. So if you're feeling anxiety, it's not just in your head, your body feels it too, So getting the students to have that awareness. So maybe I will chime in and share a personal story inspired by Yiling sharing earlier. You talked about your father passing away and your own struggle with it. So I lost my father when I was in university, and I was actually studying overseas. So it was a challenging time. He had been sick, and I was actually studying psychology, and it just so happened that that module, one of the modules I was studying during that period, was abnormal psychology, where we learn about depression, anxiety, and all of that. And I was experiencing depression, but even though I was studying it and I was experiencing it, I wasn't able to recognize it in myself. It was so theoretical, studying it from a textbook and a lecturer, that I was unable to be like, hey, this is me right now, And ironically, one of my professors made me go and see the university counseling center, because I was, I guess, visibly not doing so great. And that therapist actually made a world of difference in helping me get through this period of my time, period in my life. And it was only in retrospect that I recognized the irony that I was literally studying about depression and I was experiencing depression, but I couldn't recognize it. I had to actually see a therapist who helped me recognize that I was depressed and helped me get through it, even though I was literally studying the same thing. So I think with students, we need to try and make it as experiential as possible, getting them to learn how to access the awareness of their physiological state, their awareness of what they're feeling, what they're thinking, so that, you know, if they start to feel depressed, if they start to feel anxious, if they start to feel these early symptoms, they're actually going to be able to recognize it in themselves. And it's not a purely theoretical education.
I think the power of having that people surrounding you, or just people, right, knowing the symptoms as well is important, because as you were mentioning that, and how you didn't quite actually connect the dots, but someone else did. And I've also heard stories of how, wives were the ones who noticed that their husbands were actually going through depression because of the symptoms that they were exhibiting. And then they said, I think you're actually depressed. And the husband himself would say, no, I'm just down, I'm just feeling lack of energy or everything. And it's really, your loved ones who's then noticing it. But thanks for sharing that. I feel, I sigh because it's such a heavy and important topic. I'm glad we managed to unpack some of those today. I want to ask you two final questions very, very quickly before we wrap up, right? The first question is, and maybe we'll just get like one of you to answer each, right? Okay, so the first one is, what do you think is the future of mental health? What are you hoping to see? What are you hoping to see that you haven't quite seen yet, and you're just hoping someone would build it? Or let's say, you receive, hundreds of millions of funding today, you would go out and build it because that's something that you think is really needed. That's one. Right. Let's do a bit of future visioning there. Secondly, a little bit more tactical. For any one of our students who is thinking about building a solution relating to mental wellness, who would you recommend they go and speak to? What kind of like research, validation, what kind of deep understanding should they get, as they try and build this out? So I'll let you both decide which one you want to go for.
I'm happy to answer the first one because it's quite a like kid in a candy shop question, like you get 1 hour in a candy shop, what would you grab? Everything. And part of the reason why I want to answer it as well is because it's quite relevant to what we've been trying to do at Bravely. The idea for Bravely started out completely different from what it is right now, and it evolved over time as we talked to more people and we thought a bit more about what really is the problem. So when it comes to if I had $100 million and I could build kind of anything I want, there would be, I think, a dozen different things that would be built. But if I could just choose one thing, I think what it would really be is to help people find their own small community in a way, whether it is some people that's around them or whether it's somebody else, and just make that so that it's really accessible, and so that if you're having a hard time, you're not having a hard time alone. And I think that there's so much comfort in that, knowing that you always have a place to go to where you are allowed to struggle, where people are there to actually listen, and you have the same thing for them as well, where you get to hear what it's like for other people having a hard time. So that, hey, you're not alone in having a hard time. It's not just you who is struggling because you are flawed or you are weak or whatever else you tend to often say to yourself. But it's just like everybody has a hard time. And I think finding those people, even right now, it is really, really difficult. And I will say this, even as somebody who is working in mental health, like finding that group for myself is already incredibly challenging. And I talk about mental health every day. Like I work on it every single day. And if it's hard for me, how much harder would it be for people who don't have the opportunity to live in an environment without that stigma, with access to people, resources, knowledge, experts? It seems like it's an insurmountable not just tasks, it's just something that you can't get access to. And I think if we can start doing that for people across many different ages, start, kind of when people are young, and have that as you grow up, with that safe space to actually have mental health, whether it's good or bad, I think that would just change society entirely.
I love that. I mean, the topic of networks and communities has come out a lot across all, especially in today's highly remote world, right? We're connected online, yet not really connected. I think that's becoming more and more important. I love what you say about a safe space where you're allowed to struggle. I think that is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that thought, Melissa.
And Anita,
Yeah,
Can you
your
repeat
thoughts
the
on-
second question
Okay,
again?
the question is for anyone who's looking to build a solution in this space, what kind of tactical, practical steps would you advise them to take? Who should they speak to? What kind of research study should they do before setting up on that?
Well, I think maybe starting point would be, what do you want to address? There's so many different areas of mental health. Pick something that you want to focus on. So, for example, I think this is a pretty young crowd. So I think like cyberbullying is something that you guys might be faced with, or maybe it's like body image issues due to social media. Pick something that you are personally passionate about, and then figure out who all the stakeholders are, who's involved. So think about your target market, talk to those people, think about, okay, I'll give you an example of who I talked to, and then, and so MindFi, we work with corporate employees. So we talk to psychologists, counselors, neuroscientists, everybody in the mental health field. We talk to HR departments, the people who have a say in giving this information to our target audience, the people who are connected to our target audience, which is corporate employees. What are companies facing? What are corporate common problems? We talk to employee engagement survey companies to understand what, across the greater landscape, what issues people are facing. We talk to university researchers to see how we can run studies to test if our product is effective. We speak with tech people, AI specialists, what technology exists that we can bring into the app in order to help to support people better. So, if you're thinking of being an entrepreneur in this space, it's a little bit about being a generalist. You need to have enough knowledge in different fields to be able to understand just enough to be able to work with all the different stakeholders and bring specialists in all the fields together in order to create something that's at the intersection and can meld all these different areas of expertise together to create something like innovative that can really address the problem that you're facing. So it's not just one person you're speaking to. You want to speak to as many people who are involved and be creative about it. What kind of technology is there? What kind of professional specialists are out there that you can speak to bring in to help to create a solution?
Thank you for that. And with that, I guess we've come to the end of our hour. I think we touched a lot of things today. We talked about the definition of, mental, your baseline above being mental well-being and below being mental health. Melissa, you talked about a spectrum. We talked about triggers, right? Social media, work-life balance, burnout. We talked about challenges, shortage of mental health professionals, the stigma that's still really shrouding and clouding the whole situation. We talk about some solutions from no tech like sleep to tech-based or non-tech-based, right? Diagnosis, treatment, talk therapy, group therapy. And then I think a few key pointers here would be, how do you build a small community? How do you make this topic no longer daunting to talk about? And how do you find this special niche, because it's such a broad area, right, that you're passionate about and you really want to solve? You don't have to solve everything, but you can make a difference within that niche. And I think your idea was amazing, Anita. I thought, especially let's say, there are girls, right, who is struggling with body image. They don't have to even solve for everything. They can just solve with changing mindsets around body image and being aware and being comfortable in your own skin. That in itself can already be super powerful and will make a wealth of difference. So thank you so much, Anita and Mel. I'm going to let you both go off and enjoy the rest of your weekend. But I really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. And I want to wish you all the best on your journey of building MindFi and Briefly too. And I'm sure we'll see more of both apps. Thank you. And thank you to everyone to actually join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yiling and Melissa.
Thanks.
Bye.
Nice meeting you, Anita. Bye.
Nice meeting you too.